Welcome everybody. Great that you've chosen to come to this really interesting panel, and also the fact that you managed to find it in the first place. That's no small feat, I can say so myself. And this really will be, I'm really super excited about this very, very stellar panel, where we will be discussing the frontier of AI policy and regulation, and that is targeted at frontier of AI, general purpose AI models. So in particular, we will be touching upon the new AI Act framework that is around GPAI models and systemic risks, the factors that determine which whether such models cause harm, have systemic risks or high impact capabilities, the types of risks that are covered, as well as the corresponding obligations. My name is Tjade Stroband. I am a director for AI and Disinformation Policy in the Brussels office of Microsoft, European Government Affairs. And I wanted to first thank my colleague Anahita, who's walking down here from the Office of Responsible AI, who has been instrumental in also working with me to get this panel here, and thanks to her as well, we're here today together. So thanks everyone for being here. I want to introduce the panel. I'll introduce them all, first in the order in which they will also be giving their initial interventions. And I will start with Jordanka Ivanova from the European Commission, DG Connect, and I think now technically part of the AI office. And she was a key member of the Commission's negotiating team on the AI Act, and is closely involved in, I think, probably almost all of the work streams that you're currently working on. So especially thankful for her time today in her busy schedule to talk about the legal framework that is only technically 53 hours ago adopted by the Council. So it's normally you say hot off the press, but technically it's not even off the press yet. That's going to come in a few weeks. And then we have afterwards Leonard Heim. Leonard is a researcher at RAND in Washington, D.C. Came all the way here from D.C., so super great to have him. He's from the Technology and Security Policy Center, and his research focuses on the role of compute for advanced AI systems and how compute can be leveraged as an instrument for AI governance. And when we're talking about a compute, we're of course talking about FLOPs, floating point operations, and I think, Leonard, you coined the phrase, which I think is T-shirt worthy, FLOPs for peace. So just everybody should keep that in mind. And then we have Professor Sandra Wachter next to me. She is Professor of Technology and Regulation at the Oxford Internet Institute at Oxford from the UK, and she researches legal and ethical implications of AI, big data and robotics, as well as internet and platform regulation. And last but certainly not least, we have Conor Dunlop from the Ada Lovelace Institute in the UK. He's the European Public Policy Lead, where he delivers their strategy on the governance of AI in Europe. And he's working across the AI Act, AI liability, AI standards, and is leading projects on comparative governance and the GPAI value chain. So really, really fantastic to have this panel here today. A couple of housekeeping points to make. As I said, we'll start with Jordanka. We'll give her a bit more time than the other panelists to kind of set the scene of what's now actually coming as a system on the regulatory market here in Brussels and the EU, and subsequently all the panelists will get maximum 5 minutes for their introductory remarks, and then we'll have a follow-up discussion, provide also the opportunity to react to each other's points, and we, as this is CPDP issue, we will also have the opportunity to have questions from the audience, and finally I will round up the panel with asking every one of you to give a kind of final thought. Just to close it off. So with that, I want to start with Jordanka. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to be here in this distinguished panel and discuss the important topic of general purpose AI. So as I'm sure all of you have been following and been involved indeed, the EU has been leading the regulatory efforts for the AI, and we are very happy that just indeed a few hours ago and days, the AI Act was formally adopted. So now we are really there in European Union, having a robust legal framework that promotes both innovation and wants beneficial uses of AI, but also addresses the risks risks and the downsides. And this is particularly relevant when this comes in particular for general purpose AI and generative AI model systems that have been released over the past years, and they have disrupted the market and really made AI top priority globally and for everyone. During the initial phases, we didn't have specific rules in our Commission proposal for that, but it was indeed unanimously recognized during the legislative process that due to the impact of those models and also the risks that can be inherent, it was really important also to have guardrails for their transparent and safe development and use. So that's why, in addition to the classic approach in our AI Act for AI regulated as products, as high-risk, prohibited systems, also specific targeted rules were added for general-purpose AI models. Now defined as typically those trained on large data that, however, display significant generalities, so it's not just any model, and they should competently perform wide range of tasks and can be integrated into numerous downstream applications. And this would be covered only to the extent that those models are placed on the European market, regardless of the distribution channel. So research, development, and prototyping activities prior to the marketing would be excluded, not to hamper innovation and research. And the approach was fully aligned with our original risk-based approach, as we also see that there was also two-tier system integrated, so with general obligations for all general-purpose AI models, but also stringent requirements for those most impactful models that are posing systemic risks and those that are specific to the high-impact capabilities of the models and could have significant impact on the union market, either due to their reach or the actual or foreseeable negative effects on a variety of public interests, such as the public health, safety, security, fundamental rights, or the society as a whole, that we all know can be widely propagated at scale when those models are integrated into numerous downstream applications. And during the legislative process, it was also important to find a way how, in a legally certain manner, to identify those general-purpose AI models posing systemic risks that would be subject to these additional, more stringent safeguards and procedures to identify and mitigate them. And that was not an easy task because there were still a lot of unknowns. There were no clear metrics and also developed methodologies for benchmarks, for evaluation of these high-impact capabilities in these powerful models. So it was challenging, but at the same time, we managed to create two main avenues in the legal act that would allow us to identify with clear procedures and rules which would be those general-purpose AI models posing systemic risks. And the first one was if they are identified on the based on the evaluation of high-impact capabilities, taking into account appropriate technical tools and methodologies that the Commission can still supplement the AI Legal Act, taking into account the scientific knowledge and the state of the art in the development, that we've seen that the AI Act and also the topic has received a big push also in these latest years. And also, it was considered even at that time that the use of the compute power for the training of those models could still be a good approximation to identify them. So a threshold was set for 10.25 floating points operations that could be the one consider that those models are posing systemic risks and be presumed to be compliant. There are also other ways, because the AI office that would be exclusively competent for those models could also designate them based on a decision either taken on its own initiative or following qualified alert from scientific independent experts that we are also going to create, as the scientific input is really important in this aspect. So taking into account overall assessment of a number of relevant criteria, such as the number of the parameters of the model, the quality of the size of the data set, as we know that even with less compute, high quality could be achieved with better data, the amount of the computational resources, the input and the output modalities, and the thresholds that exist for determining the high impact capabilities for each modality, benchmarks and evaluations, adaptability of the model to learn new tasks, level of autonomy, scalability, and also as another criteria, the impact on the internal market, which is presumed to be high in case of at least 10,000 registered business users. So all these can be also still adapted by the Commission. That's really important because we know that this technology is fast developing. We are yet to see the actual impact and also to develop these robust methodologies and tools. So this is very important that we've integrated into legislation flexible tools to ensure that the rules are future-proof. In relation to the obligations that would apply to those general-purpose AI models, we'll have a standard light transparency obligations for all general-purpose models consisting of documentation, information to be given to downstream providers, and also certain relevant rules for summary of data sets and policy to respect copyright. But importantly, there will be also for the general-purpose AI models with systemic risk, additional obligations for risk assessment and mitigation of those systemic risks that providers will have to put in place and also ensure all along the value chain and also even along actually the life cycle when the AI models is further integrated to take into account other risks. There will be also obligations for model evaluation, including red teaming, tracking and reporting of serious incidents, and cybersecurity protection. And all this will be fleshed out in codes of practice because they are intentionally kept high level just to ensure that they are flexible enough, and they can be also further details developed together with the providers, with the relevant scientific community and all stakeholders involved. So this code of practice would enable to operationalize these rules, and once approved by the Commission, they could also provide presumption of conformity. But on the long term, also this code of practice will be superseded by European harmonized standards once they are made available, because this is also the normal tool we use in the internal market legislation. And finally, just here you see the entry into force of the Act is already coming. We expect it in July, and the new rules will apply 1 year after entry into force. So it's quite ambitious time, which means that this code of practice will have to be ready 9 months before that. And they'll be developed in a collaborative process together with the providers, coordinated by the Future AI Office, but also with the involvement of national authorities and also consultation of civil society, academia, independent experts, whose input will be really important also for the development of sound rules. So as in conclusion, just to wrap up, as you see, the Act is indeed a very important milestone that it's adopted, but still a lot of details to be fleshed out. And that's why the discussion today is really important, and we look forward to this collaboration and input also from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jurdanka. That's bang on time, really impressive. So thanks. I will turn to the next speaker. Lennart, Jurdanka set out the legal framework. Floating point operations has a prominent role in that, but this is certainly not the only one. Very keen to hear about your research and thinking on this point.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm just waiting for my slides to pop up. Yeah, before when I was preparing for this, I was thinking there were way more points to talk about here than I can talk about my 5 minutes right now. So I was thinking can I take a step back here and then talk about a new chain which we presented in a recent paper. So what I want to do here is basically lay out how AI systems can have an impact on the world. I think this is really well for setting the stage here. So what we basically do here, we have an AI system doing harm, right? We start with the development of an AI system, we start with the diffusion of an AI system, people are more and more using it, they then use it, they then potentially produce some harm, and eventually we have an impact, potentially negative impact on the world. And what we discuss in this paper is basically we have different types of interventions, how we can intervene here. And I think what's most prominently being discussed here is or at least in the AI governance community, is a lot of times the capability modifying interventions. This means we have development interventions where we basically train a system to have less harmful output. Reinforcement learning from human feedback is such an example. But we can also have diffusion interventions where we say we only make the system accessible to certain users under certain conditions. We do not, for example, release openly the model weights, generally how systems are being made available. But what we mostly explore in this new paper is adaptation interventions. And with this, we generally mean the type of resilience. With AI basically goes across society, how can we deal with these impacts besides these capability modifying interventions? And there we discuss 3 main ones, which is the avoidance. We can just avoid certain impacts, for example, by criminalizing certain usage. We could criminalize the creation of deep fakes, therefore less people will eventually create deep fakes and harm potentially is prevented. But we can also try to defend against harmful activities for AI systems. For example, you can start deciding on a code word with your family in case they get a deep fake call from a system. But we can also have remedies where we could potentially have backups. If certain systems get attacked by cyber attacks or others, we can just have a backup or some type of redundancy so we can potentially put them back up. And I mostly want to discuss all of this. It's okay, here's this nice chain how we can think about impacts of AI in the world. Here are different ways of intervening it because this allows us then to also talk about the risks. So what I want to briefly touch upon now is how do we measure these types of risks? How do we assess these types of things? And I think we have this requirement for assessment and evaluations. Generally, I'm a big fan of getting visibility into what's coming down the pipe. What are the impacts of AI systems in the future? And I think it's fair to say this is a nascent and emerging research field. So we just need way more research looking into what these general purpose AI models with systemic risks have. So we generally need a science of evaluations, a science of these capability assessments. And more broadly, we cannot really regulate, we cannot intervene of all of the things which are outlined here if we do not really know what these different types of risks are which these systems pose. And I think what we should basically do here is not reinvent the wheel, but we should just learn from existing risk management steps. So generally, when we talk about risk management, we have 3 key steps we usually do. We have the risk identification. We have the risk analysis, understanding the risk better and estimating the likelihood of the impact. And this is particularly hard for AI because we have so little historical data. To some degree, we're trying to regulate impacts which we expect, or where we have some probability they might be coming down in the future, but it's really hard to really define a whole causal pathway how these things are happening. And lastly, then we have the risk evaluation. Is it worth, is the risk maybe low enough that it's worth putting it out on the market? Or how can we then eventually also reduce the risk to put it under a certain threshold where we think this is fine? So I think generally the risk evaluation is really important to get right with all of these different types of steps and just really pushing this forward. And then my last remark is basically what I've been working a lot about is the idea of compute thresholds for AI systems. And don't want to go into the details here. I think we can do this in the questions later. But this plot basically highlights the amount of computation used of leading AI systems over time. And you see 2 thresholds in there. You see the threshold of the GPAI Act at 10 to the power of 25 floating point operations per second. And you see the threshold in the US executive order at 10 to the power of 26 thresholds. And what these 2 thresholds basically do, as we got laid out before, is in the GPAI Act, we have this presumption of systemic risk, right? Because what we see over time, people are spending now these literally millions, hundreds of millions for training these systems because they lead to more capabilities. Probably more capabilities means higher risks. Therefore, this presumption, and then we do the risk assessment and evaluation. So a general point which I want to close with is, I think of compute thresholds as this first trigger, this index. Which system should we take a closer look at? It's not about should we do risk evaluations or compute thresholds. It's more about we initially say which systems do we want to take a closer look at, and then do these longer risk evaluations and assessments to then assess what are the impacts here, how can we deal with them, and what we should do about it. I think that's it from my side.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Leonard. I give the floor to Sandra.
Yeah, thanks so much. I have a couple of slides as well while they're coming up. What I want to be talking about is one of the risks that I'm particularly interested in, which is the risk of hallucinations, and that's something that have been working on for quite some time now. And why did I start looking into this? Because I get interested in the question of like, how do we use generative AI? How are people currently using it most? And at the moment, a lot of people, the majority of people use it for writing tasks, research, or to summarize documents, to get news, to get advice. They use it as a database or library. So very often people use those systems to find truth. And that is an issue when we think about bigger implications, say education, science, news, and shared knowledge and history, predominantly because those systems do hallucinate, which means that they make up stuff. They make up stuff that has no basis in fact whatsoever. This is not working. There we go, yes. So this is one of the papers that is forthcoming where I talk about this in a little more detail, if you're interested in that. And the second one, which is coming forward in the Royal Society of Open Science with my co-author Brent Mittelstadt, who is also here in the audience, which talks about that particular question: do large language models have a legal duty to tell the truth if they're known to fabricate certain things in a way? And so what we did in that paper is we tested a little bit and played around and tried to figure out what kind of hallucinations do actually occur in those systems. And one interesting example is from Bing, excitingly, which is something that we played around with. So we had an interaction with Bing, and we asked Bing why Boris Johnson was indicted. And it gives you a very, very interesting answer. It says Boris Johnson was indicted because of 37 counts of various crimes related to his conduct as Prime Minister of the UK. So I live in the UK. I have missed this. I did not know about this, and I got very interested. Usually I would catch those types of things, but it's very convincingly written, and it even has sources attached to it. It has cites the Financial Times and the BBC. Those are sources I get my news from usually. So I was very interested how Bing did think that Boris Johnson got indicted. And so when you click on the FT article, this is what you see. This is the actual headline of the Financial Times article, where it says that Trump was charged with 37 accounts. Boris Johnson just stood down from Parliament. So for some reason, that large language models confused those two, funnily enough, and came up with that fabricated fact about that person. And that's a big issue when we rely on those systems in that way to find knowledge and find truth. But the other thing that is really important is that it's not just like things that we can easily fact check, like Boris Johnson. It's more also an issue of subtle types of hallucinations. So more testing that we have done with ChatGPT, for example, is that we ask it to write a summary of the GDPR. And it does it in 2 paragraphs. And here you see the answer. It says that under the GDPR, organizations have to require or get explicit consent in order to be able to process data. So that's not terribly wrong, but it's definitely not correct. Like, everybody in this room will know that there is a problem there because it's not correct, but not so outrageously wrong that you would immediately catch it. Because GDPR obviously has other ways that allow people to collect data and process that data. But if somebody's using that system to figure out what to do or to get advice, you might be misled in that way. And those types of subtle hallucinations are very, very hard to find, and especially when we use them to find knowledge and truth, that can be a systemic risk there. And then I got interested in the question how industry actually talks about their systems in public. And so probably everybody will remember the big kerfuffle that happened a couple of months ago when OpenAI opened their doors to the world, and everybody got very nervous about those systems, saying that we have to pause and think about those capabilities because they are so strong, so powerful, so intelligent, so capable that they rival human capabilities. And they're so smart that we can't actually keep them in check anymore. Some of them even compared them to as powerful as nuclear wars or pandemics in that sense. So no, the industry in general gives an indication that they're super, super smart. But what we also got interested in is the question, how do they talk about those systems in the fine print? So we looked in greater detail of what they actually put in their terms and conditions when it comes about the truthfulness of their content. And there's very different language that all of a sudden is used. It's much more humble that was being portrayed in the outside world. And then people say, oh, of course, ChatGPT makes up information, facts, and places about people. It hallucinates. It makes mistakes. Use always your own judgment. It's just an experiment. Of course, it can lead to deception and misinformation. Be your own judge. And so here, again, even worse than that, in ChatGPT, they just put it, at the bottom here and say, ChatGPT makes mistakes. Consider fact-checking those kind of things. Or here with Copilot, just in the drop-down menu, briefly mentioning that those systems have a problem with truth. And so there's a mismatch, in my opinion. You cannot go out and tell everybody how strong and powerful and capable and intelligent your system is, and then put in the fine print that it's your business to figure out whether it's truthful and take distance from that. I think you have to own the risk, or you have to be more honest about the capabilities of your system. And so this is why it's really important. And so one of my biggest hopes was that the law will actually step in and do something about that. And I'm very, very happy that the AI Act has passed. I think that's a wonderful achievement. I was very worried that it wouldn't. So everybody who was involved, thank you for that. It's a great, great, great achievement in that sense. But the AI Act doesn't really care about truth in the way that I think it could have. The majority of the requirements are transparency requirements, where developers have to inform people about the capabilities and the risks. But there's nothing there that the responsibility about the risks is different than transparency. Just being transparent about risk doesn't mean that you're capable of preventing them or that you're liable for them. And so it would have been better not just to be open about the capabilities and the limitations of those systems, but actually put something in place that requires developers to mitigate those risks in an effective way. We have this exciting thing about watermarking, which is great. So that those models have to be watermarked so somebody can see from the outside that it's actually fabricated, that it is something that is artificially created. Doesn't tell you something about truth, though, right? Because the large language models can tell you the truth. It just tells you that it wasn't done by a human. So that is quite unfortunate. The biggest hope that we have is that hallucinations will be seen as a systemic risk, and therefore will be built into the standards at some point, and then we have some guidance on how to mitigate that with highly capable systems. But unfortunately, in my opinion, hallucinations are a systemic risk for all types of foundation models, not just the quote-unquote very capable ones. And so that's really important here. In response to that, we published something a couple of months ago in Nature where we tried to figure out what can be done from a technical perspective. Is there something that can be done to tackle this issue from a tech perspective? And we came up with a method that lets you do that to a certain degree. This is a method that is called zero-shot translation that lets you use large language models in a way that reduces hallucinations to a certain degree, which is really, really exciting. And the way that this works, again, coming back to the example of the GDPR, as you remember, it said, you need explicit consent, and that's about it. If you use the same exercise using zero-shot translation, and I can talk about it in more detail in just a second, it will help you reduce that. The way that it works is that you are structuring the prompts in a way that forces the model to particularly work with the data that you have provided. If you don't do that, a large language model will always go back to the training data, and if it cannot find anything there that is useful, it will make something up. It will never say, I don't know. It's not like a human that says, that's not something I'm aware of. It will always give you an answer, good or bad. But if you structure the prompt in a way that forces the model to rely on the input data that you give, the chance of hallucinations do actually decrease drastically. And that's what we showed with this other example here. We did the same experiment again, where we said, please write us a short summary of the GDPR using the information that we know to be right. And we used the information about GDPR from the data regulator in the UK. And then that thing actually writes it accurately, and there's no hallucinations anymore. So there are ways of actually reducing it, it just needs to be done. So what I want to close with is that, yes, there's nothing in the law yet that reduces the chances of hallucinations, but we are still in the standing sector process where a lot of information and force can be brought forward. And it's really, really important that we develop systematic guidelines on how to use those systems in a reliable way. That is one example of how you can do it. So again, the fight is not over. It's just really important that we ask for clear guidance on how to implement those systems in a safe way so they don't start lying and we believe it, unfortunately. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Connor, I give you the floor. Yes, can you pass on the...
Hello, everyone. While I wait for the slides, I'll just mention briefly what I'd like to talk about. So when we had the questions shared ahead of time, I tried to put it into some buckets of topics that might be, okay, here's the slides, that might be helpful to discuss today, because I think there are open questions around addressing systemic risk in AI Act implementation. So I will just share some top-line thoughts on conceptualizing systemic risk, then some thoughts on how to designate GPAI models with systemic risk, and finally, how to go about assessing and mitigating systemic risk. So on the question of how we will go about conceptualizing and taxonomizing systemic risk, I wanted to share a quote from Google DeepMind that I thought was interesting, and they're quite explicit that when we think about systemic risk, what they call broader public stakeholders are uniquely well placed to think about the societal impacts of AI development and deployment. So I think in the context of what the AI Act will have to do in terms of operationalizing systemic risk, my sort of top-line meta point is I think it's a question for, like on this panel, we've got good representation here, academia, think tanks. I think, yeah, independent experts will have a big role to play and should have a big role to play, particularly in the upcoming code of practice. So yeah, that's on conceptualizing systemic risk. A few thoughts on designating GPAI models with systemic risk. So Leonard spoke a bit about compute, and yeah, I think this is a very helpful proxy to sort of indicate some high impact capabilities. But one concern I might have would be if scaling laws don't necessarily continue. So I think there's some particularly risky design choices that we also need to think about that could pose systemic risks. So we've been doing some research at Ada on these, on sort of advanced AI companions or AI assistants. And there's design choices that could really lead to systemic risk, and I'm sure we can expand on them in the discussion. But to take some examples, I think, personalization and increasing context windows so that they can remember more of the conversation, access your data, perceive your beliefs and desires. This could pose some systemic risks as these capabilities get more advanced. And you might not always need to hit a compute threshold to have strong capabilities on personalization. Similarly, around anthropomorphic design, we've seen OpenAI released GPT-4o. It has sort of emotion recognition capabilities built in. I think, yeah, this could really pose problems around, reliance, over-reliance, addiction, and a bunch of other systemic risks. The concept of autonomy, the first one on the slide, I think, as you introduce the ability to take actions, if that works well, it will pose a lot of questions around transparency, accountability, conflicting goals as autonomous AI agents if they interact on behalf of their user with other agents. And then finally, the question of availability and affordances. So how we think about that is access to tools, for example. access to your calendar. There might be questions around privacy there. And yeah, availability, so how people will access the AI model or the AI system. So I think these are like some key design features that we also have to think about when we think about systemic risk, alongside compute. Yeah, so then my final slide is to talk a little bit about mitigating systemic risk. So we're doing a research project right now on model evaluations. We're seeing some challenges in using that as a proof of safety and efficacy. So we would be concerned if regulation in the AI Act or in other jurisdictions over-indexes on using model evaluations. This is like quite a specific type of adversarial testing, usually focused on prompting via API. And yeah, at the minute, and I can expand on it in the discussion, but it doesn't seem to be a strong proof of safety and efficacy as the science exists today. So that's something that we're really learning for mitigating systemic risk. We've also got some learnings around the level of access. So I added a visualization here to sort of break down what a GPAI model consists of, because we often think of it as a sort of unified, singular model, but it's a lot more complex than that. You can see sort of, prompt classifiers, a bunch of models put together in a sort of mixture of experts approach, tools integrated, API access. So it's quite complicated, and there's a big question around when we're assessing these models, what we are actually getting access to. I think this is a problem that's arising in the UK context with the AI Safety Institute. There's not always transparency on what model the Safety Institute is looking at. So I think as we turn to addressing these questions in the Code of Practice in the AI Act, we'll need to think hard around, not cementing a superficial form of access in legislation. And the final point is I think we can learn a lot from the Digital Services Act. We attended a really nice panel this afternoon, earlier this afternoon, about the challenges they've been facing in BSA, systemic risk assessment, mitigation. I think we really need to glean those learnings. There's the same questions arising around access, and I'm, at the minute, a bit concerned that we don't have the mechanisms that the Digital Services Act has to mitigate systemic risk. So under the AI Act, there's no independent audits, there's no researcher access. So without these mechanisms, we need to think really hard around what mechanisms we will have in the AI Act to go about mitigating systemic risk. Those are some top-line thoughts. Happy to expound on any of them during the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Connor. That's really super insightful. So we got a lot of stuff that we've been covering here, so it's going to be tricky to kind of delve into different aspects of that. I want to start with the top line, the compute capabilities, and where we stand now and where we potentially will stand in the near future and the longer term future. And so, Leonard, would you have, what is your idea about the improvements that we would see in compute expected, and how that relates to the legal framework we have now?
Yeah, I think Connor was already alluding to it. When we draw this threshold right now, basically this means over time, using the same amount of computations, you get better capabilities, right? So right now you draw the threshold where, let's just say, it hits like a GPT-4. In the future, you can have systems which are as powerful as GPT-4 for less, basically below the threshold. This generally poses the question of how do we update this threshold over time? And I think this is more of a meta aspect, which is how do we update this whole thing over time, because AI will continuously change. So I'm generally a big fan of just writing down the requirements, writing down you're worried about systemic risk, and currently we operationalize this as systems which are above the threshold. And when we look at the Act, it's like the presumption, right? This means people can still basically escape if they can prove, look, there are no systemic risk, even we are above the threshold. You're fine. And of course, you can also be below the threshold and pose systemic risks. The problem you just generally run into is when we talk about all of these evaluations, we talk about these downstream impacts, this is a really complex chain, and this is many types of different risks we try to assess here. And the problem you run into is just like, how can you do this for every single AI system, right? So we need like some quick classifier which says, here are the systems we care about, here are the systems we are less likely, and this is to something like some kind of triage we're doing here, right? So what I generally pose is, we need different types of thresholds across the chain. We need like first indexes where we look close at the system, but then later on we need like all of these different assessments we just talked about here. And these types of assessments can be like, have a different type of, let's just call it intensity or like type of workload involved. If we find future metrics which are like also so quickly to identify, that'd be great. Because I think one of the key thing this threshold basically allows you to do, and I think this is important for certain types of requirements, is you know this before you train a system. When like a big AI developer trains such a system, and they spend like 50 million spending it on compute for training such a system, they know this before. And we might have immediate requirements when they just train such a system because there's basically the presumption of risk. And then might certain cybersecurity requirements come into it. We say like, hey, you really got to keep this model secure. We can later, again, reduce these asks if they can prove there's no risk. But sometimes we just need this thing which we know before the development of the systems and immediately after the system has been trained. And then later on we go to this more fine-grained measure, which I think should be the key determinant for any type of regulation going forward.
Great, that's super interesting. Connor, if we turning to you, I mean, looking at the different criteria, and we talked a bit about flops, but there's also a whole raft of other criteria mentioned in the AI Act. What are, in your view, some of the key ones there, and how would you look at maybe the more important ones at this stage, maybe later down the line? And then I'd also be interested to hear subsequently from Jordanka, maybe, to kind of see how what the AI office's preliminary view is on these different types of thresholds, criteria in the context of evaluation. Yeah, Connor.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really glad that Annex exists with the bunch of other criteria. I alluded to some of them when I was talking there. Like I do think multi-modality is mentioned, and I think that's going to be key. So the combination of modalities seems like that opens up potentially different kinds of risks. So it seems important to focus primarily on that. I think it's the good thing about compute as well. Actually, I'm quite keen on finding ways that these can be ex ante rather than ex post. So I think reach and number of users is helpful, but it's inherently like ex post. So that's why I mentioned in the first presentation, like design features can be helpful because it's ex ante. So a capable multimodal model probably, in my view, would need a bit more scrutiny. I think also it does mention, I believe, autonomy in the annex, and I mentioned it on the slide. So yeah, I think those are the two that stand out to me rather than as it stands like parameters and data sets. But I do think then, yeah, with those types of capabilities, modalities, autonomy, then they might require external scrutiny, and that's where like the data question would come in. I think that's going to be helpful to have a look at the data. But like I think it mentioned like the quality of data sets and stuff, and I think that's a bit harder to determine like ex ante. But I think the sort of capabilities are one that you can already do ex ante. So those are the ones right now I'm most excited about.
Good, thanks. Jordanka, any thoughts on your end already?
Well, I think indeed it's super relevant, this discussion now, because already at the time when the co-legislator was setting the framework, it was clear at that time that this is really just the beginning, and we really need to have the rules adaptable, and now that's why a lot of things can be adapted by the Commission. And the objective here is really to work together based on a sound scientific basis. That's why a lot of this emerging scientific research that is coming now is really important to inform decisions of the future office. And we are going to create also this independent scientific panel now, which is a key priority for us, that will support us in the enforcement, but also provide advice, help us develop. But also our cooperation goes, of course, beyond that, because there are numerous scientific institutions, the roles, and this research is really important. and we will work together to really adapt and complement these thresholds because I think, everyone recognizes it's fast changing and we can only catch up. But the good thing is we have the tools and we have to work together.
Thanks. I'm interested in because of the things that I've heard so far. When you look at the different types of also risks that were mentioned, and Sandra mentioned a number of them. At the same time, how, and we can dive into the risks a bit more later, but looking at some of the wording also in the AI Act where it's linked to high impact capabilities, and what is the idea of high impact capabilities as being at the frontier of the models that are on the market, and how that then relates to the actual, like the criteria that we were mentioning, and whether or not a certain criteria should have a certain threshold. Is there anybody that on the panel that would want to kind of go into that potentially tension where you can say, systemic risk versus something high impact capabilities? Sandra, I see you grabbing for the mic, so then by all means, yes, on.
I mean, everybody already said that in one way or the other. I think nobody's really happy with the flop threshold. I think we can all agree that it's kind of like an arbitrary measure in that sense. We really have to distinguish between compute and resources that you need to train a model and the risks associated with it. So the idea that something that needs more compute has therefore more systemic risk is an idea I would like to challenge a little bit. And again, I'm a lawyer by background, but whenever I talk to tech people, they are really surprised that the legislators chose a flop threshold as a proxy for dangerousness. That is true, because they say, well, all the things that you care about, which is discrimination, bias, data protection issues, misinformation, disinformation, hallucination, that all happens independent really from compute, right? And so thinking about that and more carefully, I would just say we really need to think about systemic risks independent from capabilities, and maybe flip it on its head. You should be forced or incentivized to have a reversal of burden of proof. Show that your system doesn't have systemic risk, because in my opinion, until you prove the otherwise, I assume it does, especially when it comes to hallucinations. And I think that would be a very interesting way to think about that. Just say, those systems are prone to certain problematic risks, environmentally, societally, personally, and you should show that you're the exception to the rule. That would be a fun experiment, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thanks, Sandra. Can I maybe, Connor or Leonard, and looking at the what Sandra was just saying about, there's so many different types of risk, and I think, Sandra, any type of risk that you just mentioned, you put in the bucket of being systemic, irrespective of its reach and how prevalent it is in each model. Can you say, Connor, from your perspective a bit about how you look at this specifically?
Yeah, I think what can be helpful for thinking about systemic risks is to, rather than just look at the capabilities, to think about the risk that you're concerned about and work a bit backwards from there. Actually, under the Digital Services Act, the Codes of Practice, this information there was some helpful things that they did because they used structural indicators, which were basically societal level changes that they wanted to aim at. And then you worked back there for the regulatory interventions for quantitative and qualitative reporting. So I think this can be helpful. I think we can already identify some outcomes that seem bad, that are bad. I mean, one that is very obvious and prevalent is non-consensual pornography. There was some research done recently that was saying 2.2% of women in the UK have experienced this, and that's higher than the number of people who have experienced violence, let's say, physical violence. So basically that's something that's quite clear. There's a risk. Society is exposed to a certain risk. It's pervasive and systemic. So once you understand that, that's something quite clear to aim at. That's kind of a structural indicator. And I know the AI Act alone is not the thing to solve all of this, but you can start to then work backwards and say, okay, what does mitigation look like? And there's been some good research done from Stanford on like marginal risk. So you can assess over time with the introduction of new AI models, are they exposing, widening these risks? And the non-consensual imagery one is one where it's like you can really measure it right now. And it might be possible to also measure this in a bunch of other areas as it comes up.
Yeah, go on.
I would have one comment on this. I think, like, interestingly, if you think about systemic risk or models hallucinating or more, you could even say the less capable model is like even more worrisome, right? Because it might be even worse. It's more likely to make up bullshit to some extent. And I think what this basically points to is there are many types of systemic risk, maybe in different indicators for different types of risk, where sometimes it's more important to talk about like the downstream impacted users. Whereas in other cases, it's more important. We really need to get it, for example, have like an assessment before the model is even trained or immediately after the model is trained for compute thresholds help. And I think an interesting differentiation is to be seen between the US executive order, which talks mostly about national security risk, which mostly talks about dual use capabilities, where I think the compute threshold does a better job than it does, for example, in the UAI Act for systemic risk in that case, right? So, I mean, this generally points to maybe we should need to draw like more granular domains here. Different domains have different assessments here. And then basically take it from there. And I would just pose this as a question to the research community and to the world to like do more research there and learn more about this, and then update it over time. We will just learn more and more over time once these systems diffuse and being used into the world. And there are like certain risks we're simply not aware of right now. We will just see them later on have an impact, and then we better be ready to update.
Jolanta?
Yes, if I may also chip in, I think we all agree that indeed it's not really the only one indicator that should be taken into account and that was recognized by everyone. So that's why there is the opportunity indeed to add more, and there are other avenues through which the AI board could actually designate specific models. But it was more, as Leonard said, a way to really just say, okay, this is a bit not to impact absolutely the whole community, impose disproportionate burden and hamper innovation, a bit to target the regulatory intervention. So that's why the concept of how the threshold was set and used, but this is only the beginning, as I said, not the only way, and now it can be supplemented with actual more other indicators on which we can build this consensus and which will be the important work. When it comes also to the systemic risks, indeed, that's the threshold. So systemic risks need to be somehow linked to the high impact capabilities, but already the AI Act in the recitals identifies many of the existing risks, as said by Sandra: hallucinations, bias, fundamental rights violations, false and other harmful information generation that are there and that has to be developed. It's not set in stone, and now there will be also a lot of work to further classify the taxonomy and actually develop that based the identification and mitigating measures, also taking into account the specific risks. So a lot of this can happen actually within the code of practice, and that's why it will be important also to continue and build on all these things that can be further fleshed out there as a next step.
Yeah, Connor.
Yeah, can I just make one quick follow-up point? Because I think we're still it's in the same ballpark around like sort of the use of compute and the direction of travel and trying to like skate where the puck is going to go. I mean, it seems like there is a big push for smaller models that work on devices. Like Google integrated their hardware team with their AI team recently, so I think that's like a strong indicator of how they're seeing this go. And yeah, I think if that is the trend, which is not certain that's going to be the way it goes, but if it goes that way, then that could pose significant challenges for capturing that type of risky use case under the AI, because it's still very much a general purpose integrated agent, let's say, to the phone or other pieces of hardware, but it's clearly not going to be like captured by compute, for example. So maybe just reiterating that it's great that Annex exists, and to Jordanka's point, we'll have to like update this over time.
Yeah, Sandra.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. When you look like at the annex and the classification criteria, it's very clear that the scientific community is, at least on paper, invited to be part of this, which is really, really important. I have been ranting about the standard setting procedures more longer than I want to admit to, but there seems to be, at least when it comes to the general purpose AI, a much more welcoming of the scientific community to be part of that discussion, which I think is really, really promising. And so I really hope that this will be like the starting point to have like conversations like with industry to think about, first of all, acknowledging that certain risks are just present and think like collectively about certain solutions. This is definitely like some of the things that we have developed can be easily used in that, but people just need to know that there is a risk, there's a problem, and what it is that you can actually do about it, and give concrete guidance. And this is important for the big players, but this is also important for the startups and the SMEs because they deal with the same issues here. So having just a more structured dialogue of like, this is the problem, and this is what you can do, and this is what you can't do, is really important. So I hope this will be a much more holistic dialogue going forward.
Thank you. I'm looking at the time. I want to, before opening up for questions, I want to touch upon, given we have this week the Korea Summit going on, also on safety issues of AI, the international governance framework. Leonard, you already indicated you've been working a lot on that. Can you say a bit how you see these developments at the international level kind of dovetail or not with what's in the AI Act, especially given like the focus there on frontier models as well, and all the potential risks there?
Yeah, happy to. I think, yeah, importantly and greatly, it's an international dialogue by now. I think it's fair to say the EU has been spearheading this, and actually there is real regulation here coming, which is the biggest difference to the UK and the US and all the other countries, basically. So that's great. This should be applauded. This doesn't mean the other countries are not doing anything. I think notably after the last summit in autumn, the Bletchley Summit in the UK, there is the UK AI Safety Institute, there's the US AI Safety Institute, there's the Japanese Safety Institute. I think Korea is probably also doing something, so we have more of these institutions, which are just like welcome and applaud. It's like, yes, more people looking into these types of risks, looking into these like risk assessments, in particular the UK working on these evaluations, risk assessments around a wide variety of efforts, right? This will never be sufficient, but I think it's a starting point for other research to build on top of this, because it's kind of what you're saying, just these evaluations, just having a score at the end is clearly not sufficient, but it helps us to just understand these systems. And I think just understanding and visibility is like key for what's going on there. And in particular then with these pre-commitments from the companies, if they hold up to it, to get like earlier access to assess these models, right? Which we also have in the EU AI Act, which I think is just really key to do this. And what I just eventually want to happen here is just like people working together, which is, I guess, easier said than being done. But there's a large overlap. I think there's not always overlap in all the risk. I always was alluding to the difference of the US Executive Order and the EU AI Act. But there's an overlap that both are worried about certain cyber capabilities, certain capabilities of human uplift, to produce potential to like use this dual risk nature of these AI systems. I think there could be work together. There might also be certain aspects where the EU is the only one looking into these kinds of things. And they're just the first ones looking into it, and the other countries might not be necessarily interested into this. But building an independent party, I think, is also just really key to do these risk assessments and then work together there. So I would applaud any effort of safety institutes around the world in the UAI office working together on these types of things where working together makes sense.
Super. Udanka, you want to say something, given the
no,
EU was also part of that?
Just to say that indeed I think there is a really growing convergence also at the international level, and the EU, I think, with the AI Act has been driving a lot, but there is now acceptability, and everyone is taking measures globally, including with these also commitments that we have from Seoul, exactly on topics like this, on the frontier models, where the approach is very aligned, on the future collaboration also between all these institutes. That will be really important. I think that's just also engaging with the community, the scientific, the stakeholders, the way to go that we can address the challenges related to the models.
Super, thanks a lot. I'm gonna open it up for questions from the audience. We have a lot of hands coming up, that's fantastic. We have a microphone. Sorry, I see the most persistent one was Oh, there, I think. If you could please state your name, your organization, and if there's a specific person on the panel you want to address this to, please mention that.
Yeah, Giancarlo Margeri, Leiden University. I had a question about about systemic risk, of course, the definition and content. So recital 110 gives us some examples. These examples are very broad and diverse. We go from incidents, critical infrastructures, content moderation, hate speech, health, public health. Looking at those examples, there are at least 2 or 3 cases that are not covered and in my view are socially considered systemic risk. For example, generative AI used in psychological or psychiatric support of people, just making some examples, or generative AI used in chatbot with bank customers for making investments, etc. Even though there are some sectorial applications. Now, the recital 111 mentioned methodology. So can we do a creative exercise together? I would like to ask you, can we use some parameters to abstract beyond the examples in 110? For example, number of people impacted, duration of effects, severity of a violation of normative, just to understand if there are. I know that it's a work will be done, but do we have some creative efforts together? I don't know. Thank you.
Who is there a particular panelist you want to invite to answer that question? Or leave it up to the panel who wants to answer that question?
Maybe I start. I think indeed they are just examples now that are put there, and they are quite diverse because the risks can be indeed multiple. They can be both from economic nature, security, but also societal fundamental rights risks. Now, these are the risks and the obligations that will be for the model providers to actually identify those risks and mitigate them through concrete measures. And there will be concrete obligations for this. Yes, it will be important to further specify methodology, the assessment and the analysis of those risks, but also the relevant mitigating measures. I think this creative exercise will be happening exactly within the context of the code of practice, which will aim to flesh out the obligations, which will set out the taxonomy of the risks. But I think, yeah, any ideas and already scientific input that can fit into that process, there will be consultation and involvement, and we are just starting now and plan to launch soon the process, so there will be information, but of course the whole scientific community and stakeholders can reflect and make proposals actively already in advance. So it's really effective because indeed the timeline for development of those code of practice will be quite short, and the more we are prepared, the better.
Connor?
Thanks, and thanks for the question. Yeah, I have some thoughts on this. Like, one thing that you mentioned, Jolanta, that sort of model providers will have to think about and specify the risks in the context of the codes of practice. I think it's important that the providers arguably exposing society to some of the systemic risk are not the only ones identifying what the risk is. So yeah, I think that's why we need multi-stakeholder approach for that. And yeah, I think it's nice that we have this creative exercise, like in what feels like a lecture hall. It feels like a university again. But yeah, I think what you've already started is like what the taxonomy of systemic risk will be under the codes. And I think maybe you had the question in the DSA systemic risk panel, or someone did, around severity. But I think severity is a key concept to integrate. I don't have the answer, but I think it's very important. But I was already doing some of that creative thinking of what capabilities and mapping to risks before this panel. And one I think that seems concrete and you can imagine it manifesting in some way is sort of around political radicalization or manipulation in like a commercial context. So they're like societal level manifestations that you could imagine if sort of persuasion, personalization capabilities get stronger. So you can kind of draw the line between those capabilities and societal impacts. And in my head, that's like how we start to have this creative process around the taxonomy. yeah, that's my thought.
Next question. Oh, I'm going to go to the gentleman with the laptop and the glasses because I saw his hand, one of the first open, and then...
Hi, thanks. That was a really interesting session. My name's Philip Suter from Clever Chance. I've got a question for Jordanka about sort of what happens after things come into force. Obviously, we've got delegated acts, implemented acts, guidance, there's the timetable. With the delegated acts, the Commission can start to make those up to 5 years after the AIA comes into force. Can you tell us a little bit more about the timing of that? Is that likely to be front-loaded? What are you going to, do about that in terms of stakeholder engagement? It would be really good to have a bit more color on that sort of 5-year timeline. I imagine it's going to be sooner rather than later, but it would be great to have your thoughts.
Thank you for the question. Yes, we have so many now urgent priorities and deliverables. Certainly, that's also one of them. But the really most important work now for us is to focus on the code of practice already now, because the rules will apply in 1 year, and it will really have to be a process very challenging, quick, and then also to establish the independent scientific panel, the advisory bodies, also the advisory forum that will comprise more stakeholders. The AI board we are already setting up with the member states. So first, during this first year, these are really our priorities. And the scheme is there, up and running. We have the codes of practice. Indeed, in the meantime, in parallel, we'll be working also on this really review, adaptations, and further specifications that can be done also through the delegated acts. But this is certainly not happening this year still.
Good. I see here in the front, and then afterwards the lady with the glasses, and then afterwards that the gentleman in front of her.
So, hi, Brent Middlestadt from the Oxford Internet Institute. So the approach to systemic risk in the AI Act seems relatively grounded and focused on near term, focused on things that seem very realistic. I think a similar thing has happened in the executive order, where it also feels very grounded, very near term. That's a very different approach to the UK and what they did with the AI Safety Summit. That was very sort of existential, long-term risk, we're all going to die type stuff. I'm just wondering from your experience sort of working in this space, especially with the establishment of these AI safety institutes internationally, do you see the interest sort of trending more in one direction or the other? I guess this could be for Leonard, but for anybody on the panel.
Yeah, I'd be happy to comment on this. I think I wouldn't agree with your sentiment that US executive order is necessarily near term. To some degree, you already see the difference on the compute thresholds. Basically, the US executive order doesn't apply to any existing model right now. And then, again, it's not real regulation. And most importantly, mostly what it does, it talks about these dual risk capabilities, talks about national security. It's literally using the Defense Production Act, which is for the national security of the US. And what it's doing there is basically saying, these are the future generations of models. We don't know what the capabilities are. We have some worries. Let's check on them. Right? And I think that's generally like a pretty sensible approach to learn just what's going on. But again, their motivation is mostly partially national security, national competitiveness, and all of these other angles, right? So I think the US is also already focused on these kinds of things and thinking a lot about this. And then with the UK summit, I think the new summit, the Seoul summit, already expanded the scope to that extent. They just recently announced, the UK just announced more funding in what they call, I think, systemic AI risk, or systemic resilience, something along these lines, which goes broader, like let's think through the whole chain, which I presented initially. And then also, if you look at the AI Safety Institute, they've got a diverse set of evaluations, and all of these evaluations are done on near-term models, right? To some degree, they sometimes try to evaluate risk, which we simply do not see yet. I think what's often has been discussed, the capability for models to uplift people to produce bioweapons. Right, and I think the most fair thing to say is like, yep, we can all imagine this to some extent. Is it now? Is it tomorrow? Is it in 10 years from now? And the best thing we can do right now is trying to assess this and going forward. And when, for example, a study at RAND, where I'm now at, try to assess this, we see it's not really uplift. It's just like as good as Googling, right? Question, will this solve for the next models? And I think this is just the scientific basis we need to hold here. I'm a big fan of just basically saying there's a line that goes up like this. Let's just imagine it continues like this. What does this mean? And then thinking about all of these kinds of impacts. So I want a broad portfolio, and I think it's fair for the UK and the summit to have like more focused on this. It's also important to say their definition of frontier AI is pretty similar to the definition of systemic risks here. To some degree, that frontier AI does not mean it's always the frontier. They're just like highly advanced, capable models if you actually look at the paper, what they've been writing there. Does this somewhat take up some of the questions, but maybe somebody else wants to chime in?
Very eager, yeah.
I can just,
You have 5 minutes left.
Sorry,
just
I'll be very brief. Yeah, I sort of agree with the sentiment. I think the UK originally scoped safety quite narrowly. I know like my institute sort of published some papers suggesting a wider conceptualization of safety, and I can say like it seems like they've definitely, not because of us, because of a lot of people have taken that on board. And to Leonard's point, they're doing a lot of funding now of work on systemic risk, socio-technical evals. So yeah, I'm like quite excited about that stuff.
Great.
One really quick remark on this one is just the types of risk you want to have internationally might be different than the ones you want to tackle domestically, right? And I think there's like something nice when there's like something, for example, when you talk about biorisk or cyber risk, you're way more likely to find a consensus. Just talk with Americans about privacy, that's completely different than here, or talk about like other types of capabilities with a broader international community, right? So like also this is just a consensus finding mechanism to some extent, and also to some extent, unfortunately.
The lady with the glasses up there, and then the gentleman in front of her.
Hi, Sue Ann from the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights. My question is, I suppose, to Connor or Sandra. Can the effects on the climate be considered a systemic risk? If the compute proxy is good for anything, then probably it's good for that, perhaps. Could this systemic risk framing then be an indirect way to address the effects of GPAIs on the climate?
Yeah, so in my opinion, the environmental impact isn't a systemic risk, but it's a systemic risk independent from flops. And you're absolutely right, if the flops are good for anything, they're good to measure environmental impact. But again, I would say that the flap threshold is too high to say only the models greater than 10 to the power of 25 have environmental impact in reality. I think like the massive compute that they use, that also happens at a lower threshold. And this is actually just, generative AI. Let's not forget, like predictive AI, that also doesn't grow on trees. Like AI in general contributes more to climate change than aviation. That's true. And so this is just really, really important that this is a systemic risk independent from flap thresholds. It's just something that we have to be very, very aware of, that those things don't grow on trees. They cost a lot of power, energy, water, resources. The environmental impact, forests, and wildlife is being killed because of that. It's really, really important to say that. So in my opinion, yes, it's a systemic risk. It's also something that could be addressed in the harmonized standards, actually. So there is something where the Commission was very clear that there is supposed to be efforts to come up with ways of reducing the environmental impact, and the Commission has the ability to step in if the harmonized standards don't do their job correctly. So there is at least something that we can use to push forward that is actually being implemented in the future.
Very quickly, Connor.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything you were saying, Sandra. But yeah, there's one thing I'm excited about in the AI Act. There is reporting on environmental, like energy used in training, which seems like a good first step to get as much transparency as possible on this. What I would be in favor of, just like sort of thinking off the top of my head, well, no, not thinking off the top of my head, learning from what the sort of Food and Drug Administration in the US does for pharmaceuticals going to market. So there they have to do like quite rigorous like cost-benefit assessments, and you have to show that the benefits outweigh the costs. So I could imagine a world where, yeah, if you had to sort of do that in a rigorous way and account for the cost of environmental impacts, and then think about and prove that the benefits will outweigh that, then I think that would be a very interesting like approach for new energy-intensive AI models going to market, to prove somehow that the cost is worth bearing. Yeah.
that's a whole internalizing external effects discussion that warrants a whole panel in itself, I think. I wanna go to the gentleman over there, and that's unfortunately due to the time the last question that we're gonna be able to take.
Hello, I'm Domenico Orlando. I'm a freelancer. I have a question about the hallucination phenomenon. So why can't the LLM just admit its ignorance rather than making up lies? So I don't need to quote the wisest man on earth that Socrates that used to say, I know that I don't know. So if the LLM is so intelligent, why can't admit its own ignorance? Is it something in the design or wanted by the developer?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. It's actually something that I talk about in great detail in the Is There a Legal Duty to Tell the Truth paper, but just very, very quickly. No, it cannot do that because it is not a technology that is capable of doing that. I think very often when we think about large language models, we think of like an intelligent librarian that goes to a library and finds us an answer to a question. That's not what it does. Like a large language model is a statistical model that is trying to predict the next word in a string of words based on the words that it has seen before. It has no capability of assessing whether the words are accurate, truthful, or made up at all. It can't do that. It's basically when you talk to your friends on a messaging app and you press the middle button and it suggests new words. That is what a large language model is. It has no capability of understanding anything you say or has an idea of truth. It's just predicting the next string of words in a string of words based on what we've seen before. And it can't stop. It is not, it's like a bullshitter out of, on a rampage, basically, right? It's just gonna keep going because it has no way of saying, oh, I made a mistake. It is not able of doing that. And that's something that we just have to accept, that the capability is not there. It's not an intelligent system. It cannot do that. But it is speaking in a way. It's a very good bullshitter in that sense because it's talking so convincingly, making us believe and using language that makes us believe that it knows what it's talking about. But it's just predicting the next word in a string of words based on what it's seen before.
Thank you very much. I think that there's a whole discussion there as well. I just want to wrap up by very quickly asking you all in one sentence, what is your main takeaway, recommendation, prompt to the academics, to the world on what to do next? I'm going to start with you, Sandra, and then go through the panel.
Yes, I really hope that we all really start thinking together, which means acknowledging that there are certain risks that are existing, and never take no for an answer. So that means thinking about solutions together. As I said, a lot of people have been saying you can't do anything about hallucinations, and we have shown you can do something. And it's really important not to just assume that the status quo will always be the status quo. At the moment, certain things are not possible, but if we start thinking together, we can actually come up with creative solutions that help us to protect human rights, but also further and foster innovation. I think it's absolutely possible, and it just means that we have to think together and think outside the box.
Leonard?
I would emphasize this and also just say more research, more development on everything we just talked about here. It's a new, nascent, emerging field. We need the international community for these kinds of things. Sometimes, if we can do it internationally, I would like to do it internationally. If we can't, I think it's also fine to do it domestically on an EU-wide level. And then just learn what we're doing. I don't think we will ever have perfect regulation or we will ever figure out what these systems are doing because it's just such a fast-moving field. But it shouldn't stop us from trying and just continuously develop. So I think many things we may be discussing today might not age well, and I think we all should acknowledge that and just see that we implement these mechanisms which also would just go forward and we can update them, and we all are a little bit more humble about what's coming down the pipe.
Well, this will be on YouTube for eternity, so we'll see in a couple of years. Connor?
Agree with everything that was said, but I would say we need more research into this technology. That's what the scientific community can do. We need an ecosystem of assessment, and I think to do that, governments need to give incentives for people to do this work. I think there's a role for labs as well, to give researcher access. I think people want to find the answers and the solutions and improve the science, so we need a collaborative effort to do that. And if we do that, then maybe a more specific call for researchers and scientists is to start thinking about these structural indicators that we've mentioned, you know, sort of what we want to achieve with the mitigation of systemic risk in the UK, in the EU, wherever. So yeah, those would be my final remarks.
Thanks. To round it off, Jolanta.
Well, I can only subscribe to what was said. Really continue the research, continue to gather the evidence, and also to drive the solutions in this, helping us to figure out even things that might not have been perfect, but I hope we still have chance also. And also stay as engaged, I hope also in the next phases, also to really develop together the codes of conduct. So this would be my plea.
Thank you so much, everybody. I want to get a round of applause for this wonderful panel. Thanks. Thank you as well to CPDP. And yeah, there's lots to think through, lots to work on together. Yeah, hope you enjoyed it and enjoy the rest of the conference.